Stamford Bridge, September 25th, 1066. The English army has already won a battle this morning. Harold Godwinson's men routed a Norse invasion force at dawn, a force that had crossed the North Sea under Harold Hardrada, one of the most feared commanders alive. That battle should have been the hard part. Now the English are crossing the River Derwent, moving fast, pushing the advantage, because Harold knows the Norman fleet is somewhere in the Channel, and time is the one resource he cannot replace. And then the army stops. There is a man on the bridge, just one man. He is bare-chested in the September cold. He is foaming at the mouth. His eyes have gone somewhere that is no longer behind them in any recognizable way. Somewhere dark and far back. Somewhere the human mind rarely visits and does not return from easily. He is standing in a pool of blood that belongs to 12 other men. The bodies are arranged around him like furniture. He is rearranged while thinking about something else entirely. He is laughing. The English soldiers, veterans who have just routed a Norse invasion force and are riding the momentum of men who believe they are winning, look at this one man on this one bridge over this one English river. They do not move. Not one of them steps forward. Minutes pass. An entire army stands on the riverbank and stares at a single man and makes, correctly, the calculation that going through him is not viable. There is no tactical objective on that bridge. No reinforcement is coming for him. He is there because the berserkergang has taken hold, and in the burning architecture of what his mind has become, there is only one thing left that matters. The bridge exists. He is on it, and no one crosses while he still breathes. Viking berserkers were real. Not the video game version, not the pop culture shorthand for an angry person with an axe. The real ones, documented in law codes written specifically to criminalize them, recorded by Byzantine military dispatches in careful Latin by men trained not to be impressed by anything, preserved in Icelandic sagas by writers who had complicated reasons for writing them down at all, were something history has never quite known how to categorize. Too specific to be myth, too strange to sit comfortably in the category of military history, too well documented across too many independent sources to be dismissed. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened when a berserker entered his trance state. The physical transformation, documented in clinical detail, the archaeological evidence, what modern neuroscience makes of it, and the one specific thing about the berserkergang that was so dangerous, not to enemies, but to the social order of the civilization that used it, that it was classified as demonic possession, outlawed across Scandinavia, and buried under 800 years of silence. Because the version you learned in school left out the part that actually matters. The Old Norse word is berserker, a compound of two parts. The second, serker, means shirt, a garment worn against the body. That much every scholar agrees on. The dispute is about the first part. One interpretation gives you bear, a bear shirt, a man who wraps himself in the hide of the most powerful predator in the Norse world and takes on, through that contact, something of the animal's nature. The other interpretation gives you bear, a man who strips off his armor and goes into the killing ground with nothing between his skin and the enemy. Both interpretations are correct, because the berserkers did both. The bear skin was a ritual garment, carrying real spiritual weight in a cosmology that took animal transformation seriously. And the bear fighting was real, documented in saga after saga, confirmed by consistent descriptions of men entering battle without chainmail. The word contains both truths simultaneously, which is exactly what the berserker was: man and animal, protected and exposed, present and somewhere else entirely. Most histories start this story with the Viking Age. 793 AD, the raid on Lindisfarne, the longships. But that starting point is wrong. The berserker tradition is not a Viking invention. It is an ancient Germanic inheritance that the Norse carried with them and perfected. And the physical evidence for it reaches much further back than most people realize. In 1640 and 1734, two ceremonial drinking horns made of sheet gold were unearthed in southern Jutland, Denmark, the golden horns of Galahus, dated to approximately 400 AD, 4 centuries before the Viking Age. The decoration includes semi-naked men brandishing weapons, some wearing horned helmets, depicted in postures that read, even across 16 centuries, as ritual rather than narrative. Not men doing things, men becoming things. Scholars describe these figures as weapon dancers, performers of a martial ritual whose purpose was transformation, not commemoration. Then, in 1870, 4 cast bronze dies were found in a cairn on the Swedish island of Öland, the Torslunda plates, dated to the 6th through 8th centuries. One plate shows a one-eyed warrior in a bird-horned helm moving alongside a figure in an animal skin carrying a spear and sword. Most scholars identify the one-eyed figure as Odin. The figure beside him, in the animal skin, in the ritual combat posture, is a berserker in the moment of transformation. Importantly, this plate was a die used to press images onto helmets and armor. These were not illustrations in a book. They were production templates. Someone was manufacturing this image at scale, stamping it onto battlefield equipment, making it part of the visual grammar of Norse war. These are not stories. They are physical objects, preserved in soil for over 1,000 years, sitting in museum collections where anyone can study them. And what they tell us is that the tradition of the animal warrior, the man who ritually crosses the boundary between human and beast in service of violence, predates the Viking Age by centuries. It was already ancient, already refined, already understood by the cultures that encountered it as something categorically different from ordinary combat. 3 main animal cults appear in the record: the bear, the wolf, and the wild boar. The bear warriors became the berserkers. The wolf warriors became the ulfhednar. By the time the Viking Age brought these warriors into documented contact with literate civilizations, the tradition had been failing and succeeding on battlefields for hundreds of years before anyone outside Scandinavia thought to write it down. To understand what berserkers were in the Viking world, you have to understand what they believed they were, because the gap between those two things is smaller than you might expect. In their own cosmology, berserkers were not simply violent men who had found a professional context for their violence. They were not soldiers who had broken in some useful direction. They were chosen. They were marked. They were containers for a divine quality, other, that ordinary men could neither hold nor survive. The word encompasses rage, inspiration, divine madness, the creative and destructive force that moves through the world at its own discretion and chooses, sometimes, to move through a human being. Odin was the god of other. He embodied it, dispensed it, and could withdraw it. His own relationship to extreme states was not distant or theoretical. The poetic Edda records Odin hanging himself on the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days to gain the knowledge of the runes. He sacrificed his eye to drink from the well of wisdom. He was, in the Norse understanding, a deity who understood what it cost to become something more than you already were. And the warriors who were capable of receiving his most extreme gift occupied a specific and terrifying place in the spiritual hierarchy. Snorri Sturluson, the 13th century Icelandic historian who compiled the Ynglinga saga from earlier oral and written sources, recorded the description that has become the definitive account of the berserker state. Odin's men rushed forward without armor, were as mad as dogs or wolves, bit their shields, and were strong as bears or wild oxen, and killed people at a blow, but neither fire nor iron told upon them. This was called berserkergang. Sturluson was writing 200 years after berserkers had been outlawed, working with sources that were themselves already old. He is not a primary witness, but he was synthesizing a body of oral tradition that was consistent enough and specific enough to preserve detail that independent archaeological finds have since corroborated. The verb matters. In Old Norse, to go berserk was hamask, to change form. Not to become enraged, to change form. Norse cosmology recognized hamr, the shape-shifting aspect of the soul that could, under the right conditions, take on the form and nature of another being. The berserkergang was understood, in their framework, as a literal transformation. The bearskin was not a costume, it was a vessel. Related to the berserkers were the ulfhednar, wolf coats. Warriors who wore wolf pelts, devoted to Odin, capable of similar transformation, but channeling the wolf's cunning and pack mentality rather than the bear's immovable power. The Vatnsdæla saga, the Haraldskvæði, and the Grettis saga all reference Ulfhevnar as a recognized and distinct category, consistently presented as the most elite warriors in King Harald Fairhair's personal retinue. The distinction between the two traditions is significant. The berserker was a weapon of overwhelming individual force, the bear that could not be stopped by any single opponent. The Ulfhevnar operated differently, as a coordinated group, each amplifying the others, the pack more dangerous than the sum of its members. One tradition for when you needed to break a line, another for when you needed to hunt whatever retreated from it. Harald Fairhair, the man who unified Norway. The Battle of Hafrsfjord, around 872 AD, is commemorated in the Haraldskvæði, the earliest surviving text to use the word berserk, composed by the poet Þórþorbjörn Hornkloffi, likely an eyewitness to Harald's campaigns. The poem is not mythological in its register. It is documentary. The berserkers are described as wolf-skinned, bearing bloody shields, red with blood on their spears when they came to fight. They formed a closed group. The king placed his trust in them to hack through enemy shields. They howled, they waded out, and they stood in the prow of the longboats, first into the water on every hostile shore. Think about that deployment decision carefully. You have a king trying to project power across an entire country, where the psychological impact of the first exchange can determine the outcome of the whole engagement. His strategic choice is to place his most terrifying assets at the very tip of the spear, literally at the prow, so that the first thing any enemy sees when Harald's fleet beaches is not armored soldiers climbing down onto the sand. It is something that does not look entirely like a soldier. Something already in the trance, already changed, already in the berserkergang before the keel has touched the shore. The enemy must make a decision about what they are willing to face before a single conventional weapon has been raised. The tactic worked decisively enough that it became the template. Other Scandinavian kings copied it. Some elevated berserkers to royal bodyguard status, the herd, the most trusted and lethal men in the kingdom, stationed beside the throne itself. Their presence was simultaneously a military asset and a status symbol, a visible declaration that this king had access to a quality of violence that his enemies could not match and could not fully understand. But there was always a cost to that proximity, and to understand it, you need to understand what the berserkergang actually looked like from the outside, what it did to a human body, and what it left behind when it was finished. The physical transformation of the berserkergang is documented across multiple independent sources spanning several centuries. The same sequence appears in sagas, written in different periods, different regions, by writers with different agendas and different relationships to the pagan material they were recording. Some of them were trying to condemn it. Some were trying to mythologize it. Some were trying to preserve it before it disappeared entirely. None of them are reliable in isolation, but the sequence they all describe is the same. Always the same, in the same order, with the same result. Something real was being described. It began with shivering. Not cold, not fear. This appeared to originate from inside the nervous system itself, a voltage surge moving through the musculature systematically, starting in the core and spreading outward through the limbs. The teeth chattered. The jaw clenched and released, the tension building in the masseter muscles like a mechanism winding itself up against an approaching release. Then the face changed. Multiple sources, independently. The face swelled and reddened, the skin tightening across the cheekbones and forehead, the veins of the neck standing out like ropes. The eyes shifted. Some accounts describe them going pale, washed out, as if the color drained away to make room for something else. Others describe the pupils expanding until the eyes went almost entirely dark. Either way, the effect on witnesses was the same. The face of someone they had known became a stranger's face. In the language of people who saw it, an animal's face. Then the noise, the howling. Byzantine military chroniclers, professional observers trained to record battlefield events with composure, described the sound made by Norse warriors in this state as genuinely inhuman, not theatrical, a sound that registered in the listener's nervous system before the conscious mind had processed it. The ancient mammalian alarm. Something large is coming, and it does not have a mind that will respond to reason or mercy. Then the shield biting. The Lewis chessman, a 12th century chess set discovered on the Isle of Lewis in Scotland, almost certainly of Norse manufacture, include berserker pieces depicted with their teeth clamped onto the iron rims of their shields. The jaw locked in a sustained muscular contraction, gripping whatever was nearest. Iron rim, leather strap, wood grain. The mouth foamed, the teeth left marks in metal. In iron, made by human teeth, not breakingly iron, leaving impressions in it, which tells you something specific and deeply unsettling about what the man in that state was not feeling. What was producing this? In 1977, archaeologists excavating a Viking Age burial site near Fierkat in Denmark found seeds from Hyoscyamus niger, black henbane, preserved in the grave. Henbane is a hallucinogen in the nightshade family. Its documented effects include elevated heart rate, facial flushing and swelling, extreme agitation, dilated pupils, and critically, significant suppression of the pain response, combined with a dissociative state in which the user can feel genuinely disconnected from their own body, including from the sensation of being wounded. Researchers who have conducted careful symptom comparisons between henbane intoxication and the described berserker state have found the overlap precise enough to be taken seriously. The fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria, is the more famous candidate and the more often cited, but pharmacologists are largely skeptical. Its effects frequently include nausea, muscle twitching, and sedative-like heaviness that would be actively counterproductive in close-quarters combat. The image is compelling, the pharmacology is not. But what Carsten Fatur, an ethnobotanist at the University of Ljubljana, who published a rigorous study on this question, has argued is that henbane was likely not the complete picture. Because the berserkergang was not accidental. It was not something that happened to these men. It was something they did, deliberately, repeatedly, through a ritual preparation sequence consistently described in the sagas. Rhythmic chanting, specific movement patterns, a focused pre-battle process that looks, in modern psychological terms, like a trained induction into a dissociative state. In contemporary neuroscience vocabulary, trained dissociation. The systematic, deliberate, ritually structured dismantling of the cognitive filters that prevent a human being from doing what berserkers did. The filter that says, "This will hurt." The filter that says, "I might die." The filter that says, "There are 40 of them and one of me." All of it switched off. Not by accident, by training, by a cosmology that told these men that what awaited them on the other side of death was not punishment, but reward. The Einherjar, Odin's chosen dead in Valhalla, feasting and fighting for eternity. When the trance ended, always within the hour following combat, the collapse was total. What Snorri described as weak and tame reads, in modern clinical terms, like complete adrenal and neurological depletion. Days of near incapacitation followed every episode. The body called in every deferred debt with interest. Some accounts describe berserkers lying insensate, barely responsive to external stimulus, for 24 to 48 hours after a major battle episode, the organism running a full system reboot. Two different men, same body. One terrifying beyond rational accounting, one helpless as an infant. The space between them, the trance, the killing ground, is what we need to look at now. When a berserker entered battle, the tactical function was clear. Break the enemy line before it could cohere. Shock troop in the purest sense of the term, not soldiers who advanced toward an already formed enemy, but the weapon launched first to prevent the enemy from forming at all. The Haraldskvæði describes them hacking through enemy shields, and this is not poetic language. A trained warrior with a Dane axe, a weapon with a blade spanning the width of a man's shoulders, designed specifically for use in or against a shield wall, could split a shield with a single well-placed downstroke. One stroke removes the primary defense, exposes the man behind it, and the same momentum is already continuing into whatever the shield was protecting. The mechanics are not subtle. They went first, always, into the narrowest point of contact, where the psychological impact would be most concentrated and most inescapable. And the decision that enemy soldiers faced, before any sword was swung, was not whether to fight, it was whether to hold the line while those things came toward them. Many chose not to hold. Saga accounts and external chronicles both record enemy formations collapsing before berserkers reached them, not from tactical defeat, but from psychological collapse. Soldiers who had trained for years, who had fought other battles without flinching, broke and ran. Their nervous systems made the calculation before their conscious minds could dispute it. But what happened to the ones who held, who gripped their spears, set their shields, and decided they were going to face this? The sagas give us one of the most extraordinary close combat accounts in early medieval literature. Egil Skallagrimsson, whose grandfather bore the name Kveldulf, Evening Wolf, and was himself recognized as a berserker. The violence in Egil's family is presented not as aberration, but as inheritance, something carried in the blood. In a duel recorded in the saga, Egil faces a berserker in the full grip of the berserkergang, armored only by rage, moving with the speed and reckless commitment of something that has ceased calculating the cost of what it is doing. The conventional exchange of blade work proceeds, and then the space between them closes beyond the range where weapons are useful, and Egil does what a man does when there is nothing left between two bodies but the question of who is willing to go further. He bites the berserker's jugular vein out with his teeth. Stay with the mechanics. The berserker's neck, close enough that Egil's breath is warm against the skin. The pulse point below the jawline, the place where the carotid vessel runs near the surface, where you can feel the heartbeat pressing outward. Egil's teeth finding that exact spot, the skin giving way, thin there, barely more than membrane over the largest blood vessel in the neck. Then the warmth, immediate, flooding, copper bright, the body announcing itself in the most final language available to it. The berserker's legs stop working before his burning mind has understood why. Something has failed at a level below the thought that was supposed to be in charge. The knees buckle. He goes down into what was inside him a moment ago. The crowd went silent. This is the world berserkers occupied. The sagas did not inflate the violence, because violence did not need inflating. The brutality in these accounts is documentary. It is the record of what happened when men who had voluntarily abandoned every cognitive limit on self-preservation met men who had not, and what it cost, sometimes, to end them. The sagas identify 4 distinct berserker types. The king's berserk, the pure military instrument, deployed in battle, stationed at the prow. The hall-challenging berserk, darker, a warrior who leveraged his reputation into demands for hospitality, wealth, and women from communities with no realistic means of refusal. The duelist, the Holmgangumaður, using formalized single combat as a mechanism of extortion. The Viking Berserk, applying the same dissociative ferocity to coastal raids and undefended farmsteads. Across all 4 types, one constant. In the berserkergang, they continued when they should have stopped. Arrows in the body they did not register. Sword cuts taken without flinching or even appearing to notice. The pain response suppressed, consistent with both the henbane pharmacology and with what modern research knows about the endogenous opioid response the body can produce under extreme neurological stress. Adrenaline and endogenous opioids together can suppress pain dramatically. In extreme cases, soldiers have completed actions, run distances, fought opponents, carried colleagues, while carrying wounds they only discovered afterward. The berserkers experience this effect magnified by deliberate ritual preparation and possibly by pharmacology, in a sustained and systematic way. A man who cannot feel wounds is not supernatural, but in a shield wall where fractions of a second and fractions of an inch determine who lives, a man who keeps moving after absorbing damage that would drop a normal soldier is, for practical purposes, almost impossible to kill quickly. And almost impossible to kill quickly is, in those circumstances, almost impossible to kill. And always afterward, the collapse. the wounds announcing themselves in full, all at once, with the trance no longer present to defer them. Some berserkers had taken damage during the battle that their nervous systems had simply declined to acknowledge at the time. Those debts were collected after the berserkergang released, with interest. Some of those men did not survive the accounting. They died, not in the battle, but quietly in the days that followed, the killing ground claiming them on a delay, in the silence after the noise. Here is what your history teacher didn't cover. The berserkergang did not distinguish between friend and enemy. This is the detail at the center of every recorded account of berserkers in peacetime. Every law code that criminalized them, every royal court that ultimately concluded it could no longer house them. The cognitive filter switched off during the berserkergang, the one that says the violence is for enemies, not allies, did not always switch back on cleanly when the battle ended. The sagas document this with uncomfortable specificity. A berserker at a peacetime feast, the trance arriving without the ritual preparation, without the battle context that was supposed to give it direction. And then, the men who had fought beside him that morning, the same king's household warriors he had sworn loyalty to, suddenly indistinguishable in the burning architecture of his transformed mind from any other body that had not gotten out of the way in time. The sagas record incidents of berserkers in the full grip of the berserkergang turning on their own comrades, not as betrayal, not as strategic error, because in the trance, those categories had ceased to exist. There were no comrades, there was no strategy, there was only the violence, and whoever happened to be within reach of it. They were not malfunctioning. They were functioning exactly as designed, in a context where that design was catastrophic. A weapon that cannot distinguish between a designated target and the hand holding it is not a weapon. It is a liability. The Hall challenging berserk formalized this danger into a recurring social pattern. Men who traveled from community to community, leveraging their reputation as extortion. They arrived, they made demands, they challenged anyone who objected to Holmgang, the formalized duel that was, legally, a sanctioned dispute resolution mechanism, but practically a vehicle for a man who could not be beaten to kill people legally and take their property. Egil's saga records this with documentary precision. A woman named Gyda describes her situation to Egil. A berserker named Ljot the Pale has demanded her daughter in marriage. Refused, he has challenged her son to Holmgang. He will fight the son, who is not a berserker and has no realistic expectation of surviving the encounter, and then he will take what he came for. The law provides no remedy. The system designed to resolve disputes has been converted into an instrument of predation. This was not isolated. The sagas portray it as a recognized and recurring pattern. The kings noticed, the communities noticed, and eventually the law responded. In 1015, Jarl Eirikur Hakonarson of Norway formally outlawed berserkers. The practice of berserkergang itself became a criminal act. The medieval Icelandic law code, the Gragas, sentenced berserker warriors to formal outlawry, placement outside the protection of the law entirely, killable by anyone with no legal consequence. The maximum sanction available. The Gragas preserves a specific royal directive. You shall not engage in berserker rage while you are in our service. Not a general prohibition, a personal one. A king acknowledging, in writing, that a specific man is capable of a specific thing, and that thing is no longer permitted. By the 12th century, organized berserker war bands had vanished from the historical record. But disappearance from the record and disappearance from reality are entirely different things. The berserkers were not merely outlawed, they were erased, deliberately, systematically. And the mechanism of that erasure is the thing that was kept quiet for 800 years. Christianity moved through Scandinavia in the 10th and 11th centuries, and brought with it a new vocabulary for describing things the old order had honored. Berserkers were Odin's men. Odin was a pagan god. In the new Christian framework, there was only one available category for a man who foamed at the mouth, ignored wounds, transformed in ways witnesses called supernatural, and committed acts of violence that seemed to exceed normal human capacity. Demonic possession. The clerics who wrote about berserkers after the conversion, by then the primary literate class and therefore the primary record keepers, described the berserkergang in exactly those terms. Not as a military technique, not as a trainable psychological state, as the devil working through a man who had made the wrong spiritual allegiance. This reframing had a specific operational consequence. It made the knowledge undiscussable. You cannot study demonic possession as a martial discipline. You cannot document its mechanisms or teach its ritual preparation without aligning yourself with the demonic. The entire technical knowledge base, the ritual induction sequence, the pharmacological elements, the psychological conditioning methods refined across centuries of battlefield use, was reclassified as witchcraft. Buried. What survived was condemnation. The law codes that criminalize berserkers prove they existed precisely because their prohibitions are specific enough to be applied to real people. And the sagas, written in the 12th and 13th centuries by Christian writers with complex relationships to pagan material, preserve the shapes of real things seen through a filter of literary convention and religious anxiety. Half mythologized, but with details too consistent across too many independent sources to be pure invention. The secret kept for 800 years is not the violence. Violence was never secret. The secret is this. The berserkergang was a technology, a repeatable, teachable, deliberately engineered psychological process, almost certainly enhanced by pharmacology in at least some applications, that produced a measurable and consistent change in human combat performance. It was not supernatural. It was not divine favor, though the practitioners believed it was. It was something human beings had developed, tested across generations of actual battlefield use, and systematically deployed. And when the civilization that replaced the one that practiced it could not accommodate it, the knowledge was not merely suppressed. It was reclassified as evil, as demonic, and thereby made impossible to transmit, study, or preserve without condemning yourself in the process. What this means in practical terms: the specific ritual preparation sequence, the pharmacological elements, the psychological conditioning methods, the pre-battle induction process, refined across centuries. None of it could be written down, analyzed, or discussed in a Christian scholarly context. The technical knowledge base was buried not beneath ignorance, but beneath theology. And theology, unlike ignorance, is actively resistant to correction. 20th century military research into combat-induced dissociative states, studies of soldiers in conditions of sustained, overwhelming violence who continued performing beyond what their bodies should have permitted, produced descriptions that overlap with what the sagas record with uncomfortable precision. Complete pain suppression, sustained physical performance beyond normal limits, the subsequent crash, the extended recovery, the difficulty returning to normal social function. Neil Price, the archaeologist and historian whose research into Viking ritual and what he identifies as the Seither shamanic tradition provides the most rigorous academic framework for understanding berserkergang, has argued that the berserkers were practicing something ancient and cross-cultural, the deliberate erasure of the ordinary self as the precondition for a form of combat that the ordinary self cannot sustain. Shamanic traditions in unrelated cultures across the world involve strikingly similar ritual structures, the same onset trembling, the same animal identification, the same post-trance incapacity, the same social danger of practitioners in peacetime. What the berserkers had done, in Price's analysis, was take a tradition rooted in religious shamanism and refine it specifically for military application. The spiritual framework was not incidental. It was structural. The belief that you were becoming an animal, that you were filled with the spirit of Odin, that you would be received as a hero after death. These were not comfort myths. They were the mechanism. Remove the cosmology and the technology stops working. The church understood that this knowledge was dangerous, not because it was inherently evil, because it produced men who were loyal to a pagan deity, nearly uncontrollable by normal authority, and capable of violence that destabilized social order. A combat technology that placed individual men outside the reach of ordinary governance was incompatible with the centralized Christian kingdoms replacing the Norse tribal world. So the knowledge was buried, the practitioners were outlawed, and for 800 years, what remained in public consciousness was not the technology, but the image. The Lewis chess piece, teeth on the shield rim, reduced from a historically complex human practice to a symbol of barbarism safely admired from a distance, disappear when the law codes made them illegal and the church made them demonic. Some went east and south, through the river systems of what is now Russia, down the Dnieper and Volga trade routes to Constantinople, the city the Norse called Miklagarðr, the Great City, capital of the Byzantine Empire, the most militarily sophisticated state in the medieval world, with centuries of experience absorbing and deploying fighters from every corner of the known world. The Byzantine emperors had long understood what the northern kings were beginning to forget in the wrong direction. A warrior who could enter controlled, dissociative ferocity and come back from it was a military asset of extraordinary value, provided you could ensure he stayed pointed at the right target. The key phrase is controlled. The Byzantines had the institutional complexity to manage what the smaller Norse kingdoms were discovering they could not. The Varangian Guard, the elite imperial bodyguard, composed primarily of Norse and later Anglo-Saxon warriors, incorporated men from exactly this tradition. Byzantine military accounts from the 10th and 11th centuries include descriptions of Varangian fighters whose ferocity observers, writing in the careful Latin of imperial military reporting, struggled to categorize. A commander who fought as if something had taken over behind his eyes, they noted, in a way that was less frightening than it should have been, precisely because it was so obviously effective. They did not use the word berserker, but the phenomenon they were recording had a name in Old Norse, and the men they were describing knew it. Then there are the objects. The grave at Vendel in Sweden, with its decorated helmets, swords, and bearskins laid over the body, a warrior buried with the full acknowledgement of what he was. The people who placed that bearskin over him were making a statement. This is who he was. This is what we are sending him into whatever comes next as. The Lewis chessman, carved in the 12th century, 150 years after berserkers were outlawed, with the berserker pieces still rendered in that unmistakable posture, helmet on, eyes wide, teeth on the shield rim, in the moment between the trance's arrival and the first blow falling. The craftsman who carved them had seen something, or knew someone who had. The specific detail doesn't come from imagination. The word berserk survived everything else. It passed from Old Norse into English and did not become an archaic curiosity. It became an everyday word. Berserk, furiously out of control, used daily in a language spoken by hundreds of millions of people who have no idea where it came from or what it originally described. The civilization that produced the word outlawed it, demonized it, and buried the knowledge that gave it meaning. The word kept walking through time, regardless. 14 centuries of continuous use, from the prow of a longboat at Hafrsfjord to whatever sentence you last heard it in. The tradition was erased. The concept it encoded was not. Because the concept, a person who has crossed a line past which normal human limits no longer apply, for whom the ordinary calculation of cost and benefit has stopped functioning, is too recognizable, too real in human experience, to be eliminated along with the people who had built a practice around it. Modern special forces psychology studies the mechanisms of extreme combat performance, the relationship between belief systems and pain tolerance, the cognitive processes of the most effective combat operators. What allows some soldiers to continue functioning in conditions that shut down others? The questions are identical to the ones the berserkers were answering with their lives. The berserkers were not the first people to ask them. They are not the last. They were, perhaps, the most honest about what the answers cost, because the berserkergang was never free. The days of collapse, the wounds collecting their debts after the trance lifted, the social impossibility, in any world governed by law and community, of being a person who cannot reliably control the most dangerous thing about themselves. The men who became outlaws, cast out of the communities they had once protected, because the line between warrior and weapon had blurred past the point where any law code could locate it, paid in full. The man on Stamford Bridge, bare-chested in September, foaming, laughing, 12 dead around him, an entire army standing on one side of an English river, watching, not moving, making the correct calculation that going through him was not viable. He held them long enough to matter, long enough that the engagement's timeline shifted, long enough to be written into the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, into every subsequent account of that battle that has tried to explain why it took as long as it did. And then someone went under the bridge. They could not go through him, so they went under, drove a spear up through the wooden slats, and the berserker gang finally found a way out. The lesson is never simply about the violence itself. The lesson is about cost, about the specific shape of what you have to become to do extraordinary things, and what it takes from you in return, and whether that becoming is ever truly reversible. The berserkers answered that question with their lives, on battlefields from Norway to Constantinople, across 3 centuries of documented history. Now you know what was in the morning fog at Stamford Bridge. Now you know what the chroniclers refused to fully describe. And now, finally, you know exactly why.